Back to the Expositor 99, your home for line by line Bible teaching, scriptural analysis of tough topics facing the Christian community today, and interviews with leading apologists and theologians. And today we have Dr. Waldron. He's the author of the Doctrine of Last Things, an optimistic amillennial view, and that's primarily what we'll be discussing today. So welcome.
Thank you, brother. Good to be with you, Gabe.
Awesome, awesome. So, well, first of all, how long does it take to write a book this thick? That
It's something around 40 years.
okay. That's
That's how long I've been teaching eschatology in one form or another in different seminaries.
yeah.
So, yeah, about 40 years.
Okay. That's helpful me perspective wise because I'll start a writing project and I just stop and then I'll start and I'd love to finish some of those projects one of these days, but I get derailed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I most of the stuff I write, I've been teaching
Mm.
or preaching about for a number of years, and it finally gets to the place where I feel like maybe I have a shot at getting it right, and then that's when I start trying to put it into book form.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Doctrine of Last Things I first taught probably in the 80s at Trinity Ministerial Academy in New Jersey, and then since then at Reformed Baptist Seminary, and then for us here at Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary over the last 20 years or so.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, at the opening of your book, you pose this question: is eschatology optional? And I like that you started with that because I notice a trend that either a person will tend to either obsess about eschatology or they'll just avoid it entirely.
Yeah.
So, why did you decide to pose this question to the reader and to tell them ultimately what your conclusion is that it's not optional? And tell us what
Yeah.
brought you that.
Well, part of it was the tendency to what I call panmillennialism, the rather indifferent attitude that everything will pan out all right in the end, and we don't need to worry about studying eschatology. Part of it was also so that I could make the point connected to that there is an orthodox core in eschatology that cannot be ignored, that
Yeah,
must be believed if you're going to claim to be an Orthodox Christian.
yeah,
And of course, one of the subjects of the first chapter is then to show that that Orthodox core, from the standpoint of logic, from the standpoint of history, from the standpoint of the Bible, is the second coming of Christ in glory, the resurrection of the dead, and the judgment. Those things constitute what I would call the orthodox core of eschatology that must be believed, and for that reason cannot be optional to the Christian, and are taught back to the Apostles' Creed
yeah.
at the beginning of the historical church. Another thing I wanted to do in this chapters, and I'm so glad you asked about it. Another thing I wanted to do was to make the point that if we're talking to other Christians who hold this Orthodox core, well, we are talking to Orthodox Christians
Yeah.
who ought to be treated with courtesy and respect. And we ought not to, as important as some of the issues are to us, blow them out of proportion and make them issues which will cause us to question somebody else's Christianity. I didn't want that smell to be around my book at all. I wanted to deal
Yeah.
with it right up front and say, look, there are really four positions that hold the Orthodox core. Uh, Not only amillennialism, but postmillennialism, but also but also historic premillennialism and dispensational premillennialism.
Yeah.
All of those positions, much as I might disagree with a couple of them pretty emphatically,
Mm.
hold the Orthodox core, and we have an obligation to treat each other as Christians. And I wanted to make the point that that was the way I intended to treat them in my book.
That's awesome. I'm glad that you did that because oftentimes we don't see that charity in a lot of the leading eschatological books. And one thing that was always encouraging me, I mentioned my love for Reformed theology, is a lot of
Mm,
times these conferences you'd see, whether it be G3 or whether it be ShepCon,
yeah,
is you'd see on the panel when they do the Q&A, Sproul,
yeah,
Gardner, Bodie, and it's like you Piper, and you would see this array of different eschatologies in these
Uh-huh.
different men, but they're all united in their zeal for the gospel, their zeal for proper soteriology, their zeal for line by line
Yeah.
expository preaching. And it was always a beautiful thing to see.
Yeah. Amen.
Yeah. Well, you kind of covered my next question was you were talking about those four positions, and I was going to ask you where does an eschatological position go heretical? When does it go to that extreme? And
Yeah.
it sounds to me like you were saying, if I was just summing up your answer there, they deny the bodily return of Christ and the
Yeah.
resurrection of the dead.
Yeah. And two really clear modern examples
Yeah,
of eschatologies that are heretical
yeah,
would be, on the one hand, the liberalism that denies basically the supernatural
yeah,
altogether and puts itself in the category of the mockers of Second Peter 3,
hmm,
who are uniformitarian like the liberals are.
yeah,
At the same time, the other one, and this from quite a different point of view philosophically and scripturally, is hyperpreterism.
yes,
Hyperpreterism with its doctrine that the resurrection is past already. Hyperpreterism with this doctrine that Christ came in glory at
hmm,
the destruction of Jerusalem, and that was it. I mean, there are a lot of nuances now that people have tried to deal with some of the problems, but the fact of the matter is that Russell and his parousia, that's the position he takes, and I regard hyperpreterism as heretical.
absolutely. Now, since you brought up preterism, I noticed, if I wasn't misunderstanding you don't hold to a partial preterism harmonizing with your amillennialism. I believe R.C. Sproul held to post-millennialism and partial preterism. Why does your position not harmonize with partial preterism?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. Well, first of all, let me say that I make a big distinction between hyper and partial preterism.
Yeah.
Hyper preterism saying that substantially 100% of the prophecies of the Bible were fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem. Partial preterism saying that they were only partially fulfilled. So
Yeah.
I regard partial preterism as orthodox, of course.
Amen. Yeah.
And a lot of good men have held it. But why do I not what I not hold it? I don't see any necessity for it.
Okay.
Um, uh, as even though there are large parts of the Book of Revelation that still mystify me in some respects,
Yeah.
I think that the parts I do understand are clearly not compatible with a partial preterist position. I see Revelation 5 talking about the ascension of Christ to glory. I see Revelation
Mhm.
6 as and the breaking of the seals as talking about characteristics or marks or movements that are going to mark the entire gospel age. And of course, again, from an amillennial standpoint, I see the 1,000 years as basically encompassing the gospel age between
Yeah.
the first advent of Christ and the second. Um, and so all of those things uh, take me in a little different direction in terms of my interpretation of the book of Revelation than partial preterism. Um, Another thing that and this is a generalization. Usually, though, partial preterism is the hermeneutical approach of postmillennialism.
Hmm.
A lot of the postmillennialists will adopt the partial preterist position in order to explain certain passages of Scripture. Um, Again, I'm not postmillennial.
Yeah.
I have reasons for that, but my point here is that there are partial preterist millennialists. I've heard from some,
Yeah.
and um, and I guess I need to say that um, both. I was on a panel discussion symposium really
Yeah.
with Gary DeMar on the one hand, who at that time was a partial preterist. I've been told he's gone further into preterism than that lately, but I don't know that
Yeah.
personally. And then Jim Hamilton, who is basically representing the futurist position, and I was supposed to represent another position, which I ended up calling redemptive historical modified idealism, which is basically the position of Greg Beale in his expositions of the Book
Yeah.
of Revelation. And at any rate, that was a very informative discussion, as Gary and Jim kind of argued over my head, in the sense that they were at each other's throat, and I was kind of saying, "Well, look, I think both of you are half right."
Yeah.
So, and the way to see that most clearly is to read my chapter on Matthew 24
Yeah.
and the meaning of Matthew 24. A lot of people, I think, adopt partial preterism as a way to interpret Matthew 24 and to make sense of it. I don't see any necessity for that. I understand. I understand that the Jerusalem and that the destruction of Jerusalem is one pivot or one pillar in Jesus' teaching there, and his second coming in glory is the other pillar of his teaching there. And those two things, rather than we see them as kind of somehow melded together in his teaching, I see them as carefully kept distinct in the teaching of Jesus, so that if the futurist says, "Look, you have the second coming in glory here at the end of the age," I say, "Yes, that's true."
Yeah.
If the preterist says, "No, this is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD," I say, "Yes, that's true." But what is not true is that those two things happened next to each other. That was the biggest problem I have for many years as I struggled with understanding Matthew 24 myself. My biggest problem was it does sound, from a superficial reading of Matthew 24, that the coming of Christ in glory follows immediately the destruction of Jerusalem. But what delivered me from that conundrum was reading John Murray's essay on the interadventural period in his
Hmm.
collected writings, and I quote him at large and give him all the credit for this. And he showed me that that was not a necessary understanding of the exegesis of Matthew 24 at all. That the uh, affliction of the Jews, of which that passage speaks, is not just is not concluded.
Hmm.
The tribulation of the Jews is not concluded with the destruction of Jerusalem, but it goes on after the destruction of Jerusalem throughout the times of the Gentiles.
Yeah.
And when I saw that, when he explained that understanding of Matthew 24, and then showed what Luke 21 makes obvious to me,
Yeah.
that the second coming of Christ in glory is separated from the destruction of Jerusalem by the Roman armies, by the leading of the Gentiles away into captivity, by the times of the Gentiles, by the signs in the sun, moon, and stars, and then Christ comes. Well, then I can say, look, the partial preterist is right that we're talking here about the literal historical destruction of Jerusalem and what follows it. But the futurist is right in that we're talking here about the second coming of Christ in glory was yet future.
Yeah.
And so I didn't need partial preterism to explain either Matthew 24 or the book of Revelation to me. And I was much more satisfied with the approach of Murray.
Awesome. I'll have to look into his commentary on that. I had a group of Bible students studying this passage a couple of years ago, and I told them, how many questions are the disciples asking Jesus?
Yeah,
To analyze that, because they may think they're asking one question. When will these
right.
things be, the destruction of the temple, and what will be
Yeah,
the sign of your coming? And
yeah.
they're getting two separate answers from Jesus.
Yeah, they may have assumed,
Yeah,
they probably were assuming, that something as drastic and dreadful as the destruction of the temple could only mean the end of the world.
right.
But in fact, Jesus, properly understood and properly read there, is actually saying, no, look, the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem are to be distinguished from my second coming in glory. Uh, are there, could we say, thematic connections between them? Of course. But do they happen at the same time? Absolutely not. And Matthew 24 doesn't need to be read that way. And Luke 21 absolutely cannot be read that way. And so if you take Luke 21 and Matthew 24 as talking about the same speech of Jesus, the same discourse of Jesus, uh, then you have to make that distinction in Matthew 24. In fact, Actually, I uh, I love Matthew 24 because I think what Jesus does in Matthew 24, 34 to 36 is actually distinguish between the destruction of Jerusalem and a second coming in glory. Well, let me read the passage
Yeah,
because
yeah,
this is
absolutely.
exciting. This is interesting and exciting to me. And Matthew 24, 34, we read, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone." Now, I think Matthew 24:34 has been the source of vast eschatological speculation, vastly wrong eschatological
Mhm.
speculation. Um, I had a book on my shelf, 88 Reasons Why Christ Will Come in 1988. The reason the guy wrote the book fundamentally was this: the state of Israel was established in 48. He took the generation talked about here as being a period of 40 years, and so he thought Christ has got to come in 1988.
Yeah.
That's just one illustration of a vast number of difficulties that have been caused by this passage and a false understanding of it. What I think Jesus is doing here, and I think it's pretty clear actually once you see it, is that Jesus is distinguishing between all these things taking place in verse 34
Mhm.
and of that day and hour in verse 36. And the contrast is actually pretty clear. He says, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. I think John Murray is right when he says that the meaning of this generation is that then living generation, right?
Mhm.
And of course, this is one of the happy hunting grounds then of hyperpreterism, and their teaching. Well, then Christ had to come back within that living generation of Jews' lifespan. But again, this fails to see the distinction that Jesus is making between all these things and that day and hour. In almost every language, Gabe, there's
Yeah.
a distinction between uh, remote demonstrative pronouns and immediate demonstrative pronouns. That is to say, immediate demonstrative pronoun this, these, remote demonstrative pronouns those, that, right?
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, not those and that. Uh, this and those, and so forth. And so those demonstrative pronouns are very clearly different in their meaning. One is talking about something immediate, the other is talking about something remote. Well, Jesus does that here. He contrasts all these things, immediate demonstrative pronoun, with
Mhm.
that day and hour, remote demonstrative pronoun. And so there is a distinction between two events, one of which takes place in the lifespan of that living generation, the other which does not take place and within the lifespan. And in fact, here's the other contrast. Jesus gives a time sign for all these things taking place, and they take place during that living generation of Jews. But he gives no time sign, and this is, of course, consistent with the rest of the New Testament, no time sign of the time of his second coming. In fact, that's the
Right.
emphasis in verse 36. So the point is, in two different ways, Jesus contrasts the all these things taking place, which have to do with the destruction of Jerusalem and the captivity of the Jews,
Yeah.
and the second coming of Christ in glory. Now, what is really, I think, neat, and I think some people would say awesome, and I'll agree with them here to use the word awesome, is that Jesus spoke these words in all likelihood in AD 30,
Yeah.
the year of his death, and the destruction of Jerusalem occurred exactly 40 years later. In that 40 is associated with the lifespan of a generation in the Bible, right?
Yeah.
And so it makes wonderfully good sense, and it's exciting to see that. And so I think Jesus is clearly distinguishing between the event of the destruction of Jerusalem when all these things take place, and his second coming in glory, about which we have no time sign.
Awesome. Great clarity in that. Um, you referenced Galatians 6:16 as key to show that the church is the Israel of God.
Right,
And we still have rebuttal from dispensational scholars. I happen to have a MacArthur Study Bible right here. It's not
right.
a lengthy answer, but Dr. MacArthur writes, all Jewish believers in Christ, those who are physical and spiritual descendants of Abraham, in regards to Galatians 6:16. So
Mhm.
why does the dispensational scholar, whether we're talking about Vlach or anyone else at the Master's Seminary or so forth, why does their explanation fail to explain Galatians 6:16?
Yeah. Well, there's still a book I wrote floating out around out there, and I think you can still get your hands on it. It's
Okay.
called MacArthur's Millennial Manifesto, A
Mhm.
Friendly Response,
Yeah.
in which I actually respond at length primarily to this issue of I'm responding actually to what became known as this outrageous sermon from the Shepherds Conference, why every true Calvinist ought to be premillennial.
Yeah.
So, I deliberately tried to respond in a friendly and kind way because I respect Dr. MacArthur so much.
Yeah.
But here's why it doesn't make sense. The entirety of the book of Galatians is dedicated to teaching that that circumcision is not necessary,
Mhm.
and throughout the book, um, the we hear Paul saying, "In Christ Jesus, neither circumcision avails anything nor uncircumcision, but faith which works through love," or the verse that precedes Galatians 6:16. In Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision, but a new creation, and everyone who walks by this rule, and everyone who walks by this rule, peace be on them. So the entire book is dedicated to saying that circumcision doesn't make any difference. Now, is it likely then that Paul's going to come down at the very end of the book and say, "Oh, but circumcision does make a difference because only if you're circumcised are you a member of the Israel of God"?
Hmm.
That doesn't make any sense within the context of the
Yeah.
book of Galatians. So uh, there are other problems. There are other problems with it. It's very. Let me just take a look at it, and I'll mention a couple more things.
Sure.
uh, when he says, "And those who walk by this rule,"
Yeah.
he's talking about what he's just said. Neither is circumcision anything or uncircumcision, but a new creation. And those who walk by this rule, peace be and mercy be upon them, and upon those who are circumcised and so are part of the Israel of God. Come on, that I just think that in the context of the entirety of the book of Galatians, was just talking about the fact that circumcision has passed away. For that circumcision, that physical circumcision, to be made a necessary possession in order to be a part of the Israel of God, is just unthinkable in this context. Now, beyond that, uh, one of the things that Block and MacArthur do is try to say, well, this is the only place, perhaps, where the church might be called the Israel of God. But this is unfair. This is unfair argumentation. The reason it's unfair is that throughout Paul's writings, he identifies the church as the true circumcision.
Mhm.
He identifies the church as the true Jews, Romans 2:24-29. He identifies the church as the children of promise, and he identifies the church as the seed of Abraham.
Yeah.
But we're not supposed to pay any attention to all of those synonymous terms, and we're supposed to think that the term Israel is somehow distinct from all of them. I mean, again, I don't think that washes very well, and so those are some of the reasons I can't permit the exegesis that says that this is talking about anybody but but the Church of Jesus Christ. And of course, you get tied up in all sorts of argumentation about the meaning of Chi, but it's absolutely clear that Chi can mean not only but even, and therefore that the text can be read, and those who walk by this rule, peace and mercy be upon them, even the Israel of God, even upon the Israel of God. And I think that's the way the text has to be taken.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Now, yeah, make a great point right there with Galatians. Now, despite that, despite showing that the church is the Israel of God, you still warn the reader to reject the title or the label of replacement theology. So, if
Yeah.
you could tell our listener maybe that it isn't that informed just yet, why should even the amillennialist reject the label of replacement theology?
Okay, let me talk about that. I was in my doctoral program around the year, 2001 to 2005, and I'd already been writing and teaching on eschatology for 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
And in one of our colloquiums or seminars, somebody started talking about supersessionism or replacement theology, and I finally realized they were talking about me,
Yeah.
which is and I thought, you really think that's what amillennialists told? And my response was, that's absolutely not what I believe. Um, I don't. How can the church replace Israel when the church is the continuation of Israel?
Mhm.
In the language of of the book of Hebrews, I think it's Hebrews 9. There, the church is reformed Israel in the new age.
Yeah.
The and furthermore, the whole nucleus and foundation of the church is Jewish. Uh, its Messiah is Jewish. Its 12 foundation stones are all Jewish. The two special envoys, James, the brother of our Lord, and the Apostle Paul,
Yeah.
are Jews. Come on. The church is Jewish. And since the church is Jewish and the continuation of God's people Israel, it can't replace it and it doesn't supersede it in the sense of replacement. So uh, that kind of language seems really, really odd to me, really unfair to me
Yeah.
description of amillennialism. In fact, in my discussion of this, I use the illustration of the caterpillar going into a cocoon and becoming a butterfly. And this is my best analogy, I guess, that I can come up with regard to the relationship of the old Israel to the new Israel.
Yeah.
Um, but it's like saying that the butterfly replaces the caterpillar. No, it doesn't. The butterfly is the caterpillar in a new age and a new form.
Yeah.
And so I just think I think the whole terminology, replacement theology, supersessionism, and the claim that amillennialism, and this is made, I can cite authors and books
Mhm.
that amillennialism is anti-Semitic for some reason is just very wrong.
Yeah. Someone asked me that question earlier this week, and I said, yes, I do disagree with replacement theology, being that it's a straw man and a pejorative.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Um, you used Matthew 16, 17 through 19, the reference to the gates of hell will not prevail to
Mhm.
support your all-millennialist position as a optimistic one, an
Yeah.
offensive one. Can you
Uh-huh.
help the listener understand that a little bit more, where typically that's not what pops into our head when we hear that passage?
Yeah. Well, the reason it doesn't pop into our heads is because I think there's a real problem with the way one of the verbs here is translated.
Yeah,
And um, so let me just read the passage. I also
absolutely.
say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. Now, let me point out first of all that if it wasn't for the the problem with the translation of the verb here translated overpower in the New American Standard. The whole thrust of this verse is positive and optimistic.
Hmm.
You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church.
Yeah.
Well, there's the promise, and this one's indisputable and can't be denied, that Christ is going to build his church, that the church age is not going to end in failure, as dispensationalism said, but it's going that Christ's church will be built. And and this is one of the foundations for my optimism about the church. Christ has promised that his church will be built. But now what raises doubts in people's minds is the whole statement, and the gates of hell will not overpower it. That kind of translation of the verb here
Hmm.
uh, seems to say uh, that the gates of Hades are attempting to overpower. They're attacking the church, but they won't overpower it. Or let me just get some of the translations and other English versions here of this.
Yeah.
Um, and the gates of hell, ESV, shall not prevail against it. Well,
Yeah.
all this makes it sound like that it's the gates of hell, the gates of Hades, that are on the offensive. The problem is that the verb used here, um, uh, let's see if I can say the long Greek verb
Okay.
properly here, kataskususin.
Mhm.
That verb is used in the Old Testament, and its basic meaning is to make strong
Okay.
or be strong.
In the
And
Septuagint.
in the Old Testament, it's actually used of in a couple of places of strengthening fortifications, defensive fortifications. And I cite the text in my chapter on this. It's actually used of defensive fortifications being strengthened, and this is the verb that's used. Now, and when you understand this, and you take a translation perfectly acceptable, I think, in terms of the way it's used in the Old Testament, and the gates of Hades will not be strong against it,
Hmm.
will not be strong uh, against it, over it, something like that. Then you see, then you're prepared to say, oh, we're how can we be talking about Hades being on the offensive? We're talking about gates here, uh, and and we're talking about the church then assaulting the gates of Hades. So it's the church that's on the offensive, and the gates of Hades will not be strong against it. They will crumble before the attack of the church. Well, uh, and so then you say to yourself, well, duh, the gates of Hades are not offensive, they're defensive. And so once you understand the right way to take the verb here, kataskusasin, then you say, oh, this makes a lot more sense if we take it as the church being on the offensive rather than the church on the defensive, because we're talking about gates and it's in the context of the promise, I will build my church.
Yeah. And the Lord of the Rings analogy was helpful for me. So
Oh, yes.
thanks. It helped me to see that, okay, yeah, they're on the offensive against the gates of Mordor there, So
Yeah.
that was helpful.
Yeah.
Do you have time for two more questions?
Sure thing.
All right. I don't think you mentioned this one in the book, but whenever I hear premillennialists talk about amillennialists, they often give like a jab or do some kind of sarcastic remark about Revelation 20, verse 2. And he laid hold on the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil, and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years. And then they'll say something along the lines like, well, if the devil's bound right now, the way almost say that's a pretty long chain. And they'll say something sarcastic. What
Yeah.
should be
Yeah.
our response to defending, yes, that is bound
Yeah.
right now. Yes, the devil is bound right now. What should be our defense to that response?
Yeah. Well, the first thing that has to be understood, and I think where um, dispensationalism goes wrong, and Revelation 20 is that we're talking about apocalyptic language here. This
Absolutely.
is apocalyptic language, and it needs to be understood from the get go as figurative. That being the case, then we have to ask, what is this language of, in a vision, a dragon being bound and cast into an abyss. What does that figurative language, what does that visionary language mean in the real world? Just as in Narnia, we're constantly having to say, well, who's Aslan in the real world? It's of course our Lord Jesus Christ in
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis's marvelous a series of children's stories.
Yeah.
Well, in the same way, we have to ask, and this is not just true for this, but throughout the Revelation 20, we have to ask, how do these visions translate into the real world? Now, uh, another principle of interpretation is that such figurative language has to be interpreted in accord with the more literal and plain teaching of the rest of the scriptures. And so, in dealing with this binding of Satan, I say, all right, now, do we have other places in the New Testament where it talks about the binding of Satan and tells us when that happened? And I cite six different passages from the rest of the New Testament and a seventh passage from the book of Revelation, all of which associate the binding of Satan with the death of Christ and his resurrection and his first advent. Of course, the first one I deal with is Matthew 12, 28 and 29, which actually uses the very word used in Revelation 20 for bind to talk about the binding of the strong man. And
Yeah.
it's obviously talking about the work of Christ there.
Yeah.
So, and maybe this is a little bit of a snide comeback to them, but I say, you have these six different passages in the New Testament, all of which associate the binding and restraint of Satan with Christ's first coming, and and so I say maybe someone will say, well, that's not fair. You should turn to the passages which associate the binding of Satan with the second coming of Christ, and then I say, yeah, but there aren't any.
Hmm.
This is the only one. If there's a reference to the binding of Satan at Christ's second coming, it's Revelation 20 and no other passage. So to interpret Revelation 20 and use the common sense principle of interpretation that the literal and the plain should interpret the symbolic and the obscure,
Yeah.
it leads you directly to the notion that Satan was bound. That is to say, in the real world, in a wonderful way, restrained in a way that he hadn't been restrained before. And then the other thing I do is I go back to the book of Revelation and say, let's ask, let's try to understand what it means to bind Satan by seeing what happens when Satan is unbound, which
Hmm.
is, of course, what Revelation 27 to 10 talks about. And Revelation 27 to 10 makes clear that the result of the unbinding of Satan is his being loosed and is gathering the nations together to in a global assault on the church, right?
Yeah.
That's what it's talking about. And so when you ask, well, if that's what his unbinding meant, what does his binding mean? It means that he is restrained from creating a global assault on the church, which is going to destroy the church's missionary endeavor, which is going to undermine the church's mission to preach the gospel to all the nations before the end comes, and he is unable to stop that.
Hmm.
And in this, I think, is the simple and honestly a very appealing way of interpreting Revelation 20 and the binding of Satan. If you interpret it within its context as a figurative uh, kind of language, and in light of what the rest of the Bible teaches about the binding of Satan.
Yeah. Yeah. As you were saying that, it made me think of the book of Job, that Satan is restrained from killing Job. Uh,
Right,
he's able to do quite a bit of havoc
right,
still, but he's restrained from
yeah.
actually taking Job's life.
I actually, when I talk about this, I say, look, here's Satan. He's got the mightiest empire he's ever created at his disposal. Here are 120 helpless Christians in Jerusalem. Why doesn't he just go in and slaughter them? Why
Hmm.
doesn't he stop the whole thing and kill it in its infancy? And what's the reason? What's the answer? He's bound. That's the answer.
Okay. Hmm. Last one here. You kind of touched on it with the reference to apocalyptic literature, but why is recapitulation a better interpretive lens, a better hermeneutical lens over the regarding the book of Revelation than this literal linear view the dispensationalist takes?
Well, and which the historicists
Yeah.
take as well.
Yeah.
The reason is that uh, that that kind of symbolic chronological uh, interpretation of the Book of Revelation makes hash of it.
Hmm.
Uh, so, one of the clearest ways that this happens is that at the end of uh, seventh um, the seventh trumpet and in chapter 11, you come to a clear statement of the general judgment. Let me just make sure I'm getting that correct from my memory here. Revelation 12. You go back to Revelation 11, and we read in verse 18, and the nations were enraged, and your wrath came. The time came for the dead to be judged. Time to reward your bondservants, the prophets, and the saints with those who fear your name. The small, the small, uh, um, and the great, and to destroy those who destroy the earth.
Hmm.
That's a reference, a plain reference to the general judgment at the end of the age, and the easiest way to see uh, that there must be recapitulation is that when you come then to Revelation 12, you have a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and moon under her feet, and her head a crown of stars. And then in verse 2 we read, and she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain, to give birth. And verse 3, then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head were 7 diadems. And and we read there, the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. And we read in verse 5, and she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Now, if you take the chronological kind of historicist and also a futurist
Yeah.
interpretation, which takes things one by one and assumes that if it follows in the vision, it follows in history, then you have the ascension of Christ to the right hand of God following the general judgment. Come on, right?
Hmm.
That's my
Yeah.
response. Come on.
Very good. Very good. Um, I had one more question on the age and the age to come. But if you need to get going, I don't want to keep you from your lunch or your next class.
Ask your question. I can give you a brief answer about that, I hope.
Okay. Uh, you made it foundational to the book and to your theological position about the age and the age to come system, opposed to many dispensations. And I thought you did a great job of that, showing that with all the parables.
Yeah.
Why does that strengthen the amillennialist position the most? Why doesn't the age and the age to come strengthen the post-mill position or the historic pre-mill position? Why does it strengthen the amill position?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Let's take premillennialism and then we'll take
Okay. Okay.
postmillennialism.
Hmm.
Uh, it tells against premillennialism because the basic distinction is between this age and the age to come. And the key passage here is Luke chapter 20,
Yeah.
which contrasts this age and the age to come. And the four contrasts there are really difficult for premillennialism to absorb into its system because you have the contrast between marriage and no marriage, death and no death, mixed good and evil men in this age, uh, only sons of God in the age to come, and
Yeah.
finally you have unresurrected men in this age, and only resurrected sons of God in the age to come. Now that contrast in Luke 20 really gives premillennialism no place to hide
Mm.
because Revelation 20 cannot be fit as premillennialists interpret it into either this age or the age to come. That's the problem.
Yeah.
With regard to postmillennialism, the difficulty is when you begin to talk about the ways in which this age and the age to come, in a sense, overlap, in which the age to come is anticipated in some ways in this age. Um, it's clear that during the entirety of this age, until the coming of the second of the age to come in its glory and its fullness, uh, we're going to be we're going to have this tug of war, this struggle between good and evil.
Mhm.
The sons of this age are evil men. Uh, to be conformed to this age is to be and walk in an evil way. And on you can go with the kind of negative language about this age, which characterizes it up until the second coming of Christ. So uh, all of this then kind of brings to mind the words of Jesus in Matthew 13:30 that with regard to uh, God's field, both good and evil are going to grow together until the harvest. Um, and and that's the difficulty for postmillennialism. Um, I think we can be optimistic about the church because we can say God has promised that the good will grow, but he's also said that the evil is going to grow contemporaneous with that. That there's going to be both good growth and evil growth, and neither one is going to wipe out the other, which has been the problem with both postmillennialism and premillennialism. Premillennialism and its pessimism has normally said that the growth of the evil is going to stunt and finally cause the church age to end in failure.
Mhm.
Postmillennialism has said, well, the growth of the good is going to finally result in the triumph of righteousness and a great golden age of peace, righteousness, and prosperity. Well, but that's not what Jesus says. Jesus really teaches the paradoxical truth that both good and evil are going to grow together until harvest. And I think when that's examined, there are deep truths in it that are really instructive about the nature of good and evil. At any rate, that's my response.
Awesome. Thank you so much for clarifying that. All right,
Mhm.
everyone. This has been an interview with Dr. Waldron, the author of The Doctrine of Last Things, an optimistic amillennial view. I highly recommend, if you're a student of theology or just of eschatology as well, to check this out and get a copy of your own. Dr. Waldron, before we tune out, do you want to tell the listener how they could support your
Yeah.
ministry, conferences, upcoming book projects?
Oh, well, thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I always like to talk about Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary. We are committed to confessional, accessible, and affordable seminary education. Check us out at cbtseminary.org. I happen to be the president of that seminary and also the professor of systematic theology there. So I'd love for your listeners to check us out. We're thankful for what God is doing and for the way God is giving us usefulness in the lives of men around the world. We are primarily a distance education institution, so you don't have to leave your church or quit
Hmm,
your job to study with CBTS.
that's encouraging to know.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been a privilege and an honor.
Thank you, Gabe. Good talking with you.
You as well.